We all know about the mixed territorial claims that during the colonial era of early Western New York. Well, we're going to be talking about the epicenter of those controversial claims. Really wasn't that controversial. It was just competition. That's all it was. That's what we'll be talking about on this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report, which, as always, is brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Mendon Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hi there, and welcome again, everyone, to yet another edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa. This week, we have Robert Emerson. He's the executive director of Old Fort Niagara, an interesting story, which we'll get to in a moment. But Bob, first, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you go from where you started to becoming executive director of Old Fort Niagara?
Well, I've always been interested in history. My parents were interested in history. I've spent over 45 years in the museum business, either in running historic sites or museums. And Old Fort Niagara has always been one of my favorite historic sites, even coming here as a tourist back in the 70s and early 80s. So in 1997, when I saw the advertisement for the executive director's position here, I jumped at it, and lo and behold, they hired me, and I've been here ever since. So it's just an incredible historic site. History is fascinating, and it's a great place to work.
You know, I went there too when I was a kid, and I still have the three little flags representing the three different nations that once ruled that fort. Tell us a little bit about the history of that fort. When did it start? Maybe why did it start? And just the conflicts that arose because the fort was there.
Sure. Of course, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the best way to travel was by the water. There were very few canals. Roads were terrible. Railroads didn't exist yet. So the lakes and the rivers were the way to get around, the best way to get around. And of course, the Great Lakes, they are a great water superhighway into the interior of the continent. And so the sort of choke point on that superhighway was Niagara Falls. You couldn't get around it in a boat. So there was a portage road that bypassed Niagara Falls. So whoever controlled the spot where Fort Niagara is situated could control that portage road and really keep their enemies out of most of the interior North America. So very, very strategically important spot. This site had been used by native people as a hunting and fishing camp for a long, long time when the Europeans arrived. First Europeans were the French. They were the first to explore the area. And they made a couple of attempts to fortify the site in the 17th century, but it really wasn't until 1726 that the French were able to build a more permanent installation here. And in that year, they began construction of what we call today the French Castle. And it was a big stone building that was designed to house about 40 soldiers. And that castle was the nucleus of a fort that grew and grew and grew into what was considered by the middle of the 18th century one of the most elaborate earthen fortifications in North America. So it was during the French and Indian War. It was held by the French until 1759, when the British came and they laid siege to the fort for about almost 3 weeks. And at the end of that siege, the French were forced to surrender the post, and it became British. And then the British remained here for about 40 years. They held the fort during the American Revolution and used it as a base for launching raids against the frontiers of New York and Pennsylvania. British, of course, had troops here, but there were all kinds of Native American allies coming here to receive supplies and weaponry, and then they were launching off on these devastating raids against the frontiers of the colonies. And this was diverting important manpower and equipment, supplies away from Washington's main effort along the seaboard. So this was a very, very important post for the British to hold. They, at the end of the Revolution, they were supposed to have turned Fort Niagara over to the United States. The peace treaty provided for that, but there were disputes, and those disputes took a while to work out. And it wasn't until 1796 that the fort actually is transferred to the United States, and the first U.S. garrison marches in here. The United States holds the fort until the War of 1812. Another war breaks out between the United States and Britain. Right across the river from Fort Niagara, about 1,300 yards away, the British had built their own fort called Fort George, and those two forts are well within cannon range of each other. So there's a couple of occasions when the forts bombard each other, but in December of 1813, the British are going to capture Fort Niagara. They're going to launch a daring pre-dawn assault, December the 19th of that year, and they captured the fort in about 30 minutes, and they captured our flag, which they took back to Scotland, and we have back now, by the way. We'll talk about that later. But the fort is now held by the British through the end of the War of 1812. And when that treaty is signed ending that war, everything goes back to status quo antebellum. So the fort comes back to the United States. And that's the last armed conflict that the fort is involved in.
So that's a great long history of the fort, early history of the fort. There's so much packed in there. Let's kind of drill down on a couple of the things that we talked about. The first is during the Revolutionary War, how the fort was used, and they would launch the raids. Are these the raids that presaged the Sullivan March, the march that George Washington said, hey, we got to stop this? Is that the raid? Are those the raids that you're talking about?
Yes. The British were providing arms and ammunition and supplies to these raiding parties, and the raids really began in earnest in late 1777, early 1778, particularly aimed against the Mohawk Valley. And these are small-scale raids, but there were numerous attacks, and they were happening all over the place. So it was very difficult for the defenders of the Mohawk Valley to respond to them. But a lot of them were coming out of Fort Niagara, some of them coming down from Canada through Oswego. So yeah, those were hit and run raids that were very devastating, destroying buildings, destroying crops, livestock, etc.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's what prompted George Washington to invade the country of the Six Nations in 1779.
So when Sullivan's campaign was completed, and it effectively pushed the Iroquois Confederacy off the map, and they ended up where? In Fort Niagara, right? Isn't that where most of the refugees went? And
a lot of the refugees did come to Fort Niagara. Thousands of them came here, and many died of starvation, exposure during that winter. The winter of 1779, 1780 was a particularly bitter one. And many of these refugees, the British were unable to feed them. They were not prepared for this. So hundreds and hundreds of people died of starvation and exposure during that winter. But one of the one of the problems with the whole Sullivan campaign was that now the native people are more dependent on the British. So they're going to be back in the field in 1780, launching even bigger raids against the frontier.
Mm. So let's now talk about much later in history. So since 1812, or from the period of 1812, say 100 years after that, what was the disposition of the fort? Who took care of it? Who maintained it? Was it ever abandoned? How did the fort get treated during that era?
Well, after the War of 1812, the fort goes through periods of activity and periods of inactivity. With the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, the fort loses its strategic importance. So there were times when there was only a caretaker here to keep an eye on, the supplies and the buildings, and then there were other times when they moved garrisons in. An example would be during the Civil War. There were a couple of things happening here. Um, there was a unit, a federal infantry unit, the 7th Infantry, that was captured by Confederates in New Mexico. And they were captured in New Mexico in July, and they were put on parole, meaning that you just promise not to fight for a particular period of time. So they sent them to the Great Lakes, and the 7th Infantry, a company of them, ends up here in November of 1861. So you're going from being posted in New Mexico in July to Fort Niagara in November. It must have been quite an adjustment for these guys, and they stayed here until they were exchanged, and then they sent them to Fredericksburg, where most of them were mowed down in that horrible battle.
Oh,
So there's an example of this kind of quiet backwater fort in the mid 19th century, all of a sudden getting a garrison that was staying here for the best part of a year. After that, after the Civil War, uh, the fort reinvents itself again. Now, at the late 1860s, the walls are falling down. They're no longer defensible. And so the Army moves out of the old fort, which we can see here, and they move out into what's now Fort Niagara State Park. And they established a more modern military base there. They erect medical facilities. They build a 1,000-yard rifle range, which becomes very, very famous. And that rifle range attracts troops from all over the country to train here. Um, and that's bringing in lots and lots of troops. Then we even had a part of a regiment of Buffalo soldiers here prior to World War One. A lot of people don't know about these were African American troops, part of the Black Regiment. They were here for a summer in 1909, and then in World War One, there are two, excuse me, there are two Reserve Officer Training Corps camps here. They're training officers for service in Europe in World War One, and they were literally 90-day wonders. The camps lasted about 3 months, and they even dug east of the fort. They even dug an elaborate trench system to duplicate the trenches that were existing in northern France at that time, to train these guys how to deal with trench warfare, because this was something new, particularly for the U.S. Army. So those two camps were here in World War One, and then World War Two, we had a couple of things happening here. There was an induction center. So if you're from Western New York and you went in the military in World War II, you probably came through Fort Niagara. And then later in the war, there was a prisoner of war camp here. A couple of thousand German and Austrian POWs were interned here 1944, 1945, and they were often loaned out to local farmers. They would send them into Buffalo to shovel snow off the streets, and many of them maintained strong friendships with the families that they met here while they were prisoners of war. After World War II, the fort again reinvents itself. The U.S. is worried about all of the industries and the power plants around Niagara Falls and Buffalo. And so they're afraid that these industries are going to be the target of Russian bombers during the Cold War. So they ringed the area with Nike missile installations, and Fort Niagara became the headquarters for those installations. So we're very fond of saying that when the fort was first established, soldiers were armed with muskets. When the fort was decommissioned by the U.S. military, they were armed with missiles. So muskets to missiles is kind of a trademark here.
Muskets and missiles. Wow. Well, we'll get a little bit more into the fort, maybe some of the renovations when we get back from these messages. So stay tuned, folks.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to this week's edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. With us today is Robert Emerson. He's the Executive Director of Old Fort Niagara. Now, Bob, tell us a little bit about the fort itself. This is actually the thing that most people see. It's the most prominent edifice, I think, when you go visit the fort. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe describe. We're going to go into the pictures from the 20s, and you can tell us what those are. But start with the fort itself and what people see when they first enter the compound.
Well, sure. We're a 22-acre historic site. When you first arrive, we have a visitor center that has orientation exhibits. We've got a theater where you can watch a surround sound movie about the history of the fort. We have our War of 1812 flag on display in that visitor center, as well as a lot of artifacts from that have been recovered archaeologically here over the years. And that visitor center gives you a really nice introduction to the fort. From there, you walk in past the earthen works, the very elaborate fortifications that date back to the French and Indian War. You enter through the Gate of Five Nations, which is down there on the lower left. You're going to see original buildings. That's another thing that sets this fort apart from many others. Is these buildings are largely not reconstructions; they're originals. So you have buildings from the 1720s, the 1750s, the 1770s, all stone buildings that have survived the test of time. So you can go from one building to another. We have various interpretive devices. We have some audio units. But I think what people enjoy most are the living history aspects of the fort. We have a lot of interpreters in period attire that demonstrate everything from muskets to blacksmithing to cooking to the fur trade and explaining how that worked on the Great Lakes. So those programs are very, very popular, and they help to immerse people in the time period. Yeah, it's quite a interactive experience.
Now, tell us a little bit about what these pictures are from the 1920s.
Well, After World War One, we talked about how the Army moved outside the fort and built a more modern base. Well, by the 1920s, the old fort, they really weren't using it for anything anymore except maybe storage. And the buildings, the historic buildings here began to deteriorate. And that's when local citizens formed the Old Fort Niagara Association, which set about trying to restore the fort and open it as a museum. So this was happening from 1927 onward. And these photos were taken about the time of the restoration. They were trying to raise money to restore the buildings, which were in quite bad shape in some cases. They were fortunate in that the commandant, there's still an army base here, but the commandant of the army base was a history buff. And he was also able to get funding out of the War Department to help restore the fort. So this was a very early example of historic preservation. It was well ahead of its time.
So tell us about what's going on this summer at Fort Niagara. What can people expect to see?
Well, we've got a very busy program coming up. In fact, next Saturday, May 13th, we have a brand new event called Native Nations at Niagara. And this is going to be a Haudenosaunee Native American smoke dance competition. There'll be vendors with Native American crafts, Native American foodways, and throughout the afternoon, various teams will compete for prizes as to who's the best smoke dancer. So you'll be able to hear Native singing, Native music, and watch these fascinating dances that just riveting to watch this. So that's coming up next Saturday, May 13th. And then we roll into Memorial Day weekend. We have an event called Soldiers Through the Ages, which is really, really educational. You can compare uniforms, equipment, weaponry from the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. It comes up to actually up to today. And it's a great way to see how things change over the years and how things change stay the same as well. So that's Memorial Day weekend. In June, we tip our hats to the British occupation of the fort when we're having the King's birthday, King George's birthday, on the first weekend in June. There's a King's birthday ball on Saturday night, and then public programs during the day on Sunday. Big event of the year, July 4th weekend, and actually this year it's July 1st through 3rd, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Will be the French and Indian War encampment. That's our biggest of the year, and it's when we recreate the siege of Fort Niagara during the French and Indian War. And that brings in about 600 reenactors. So if you want to see a lot of cannons firing and battle reenactments, huge living history camps and demonstrations going on everywhere, that's a great weekend to come and visit the fort. We have some other events later in the summer, a Revolutionary War encampment on July 22nd, 23rd. We go to, on Labor Day weekend, we have a War of 1812 encampment. So we're covering all these great moments in the fort's history, and they're all very interactive, very educational, but also very much fun.
Well, as usual, it was our standard question from the audience here. And if you want to ask a question, just put it in the chat. We'll refer it over. How do we get there? What's the best way to get to Old Fort Niagara?
Well, it depends on where you're coming from, but if you take the thruway toward Buffalo, and you can get on to the 190 North, that will take you to the Niagara Scenic Parkway, and that will deliver you right to our door. So it's the 90 to the 190 to Niagara Scenic Parkway, and it's all very well signed. And Niagara Scenic Parkway runs right up to Fort Niagara State Park.
How close is it to Niagara Falls?
It's 15 miles, but it's mostly it's limited access highway, so it's a quick trip. We're about 20 minutes from Niagara Falls.
So it's something that people can go to over the summer, making an entire day trip out of it. Not that far away, easy to get to by expressways. Is there any kind of message that old Fort Niagara wants to say to people in the 21st century?
Well, I think our message is that, to know where we are today and where we're headed, we have to understand what's happened in the past. And I often use a sort of a metaphor that, would you buy a used car without knowing its history? Well, it's the same thing on a larger scale. Knowing your history makes you a better citizen. It helps you understand why things are the way they are, and it helps guide you into the future. So places like Old Fort Niagara are great places to learn about history because it's multi-sensory. You're not just reading about it, or you're not just sitting in a lecture listening to someone talk about it. You can actually see the sights, hear the sounds, smell the smells. I don't know if that's a good thing, um, but it's immersive, and you can really experience history here in a way that I think you can't in other places. So it helps you learn about the past, which makes you a better citizen and informs you about the future.
We had another question coming. This one's interesting, and that is, has it ever been used in a movie? You say there's a lot of old buildings there, so it brings up the idea that Hollywood might want to come and use it as a backdrop for a period piece.
Yeah, lots of times it's been used in a movie. I think years ago it was used in the Philip Nolan story, which was The Man Without a Country. Uh, we've had there was a movie made about one of James Fenimore Cooper's novels, um, not Last of the Mohicans, but Fort Niagara was used, as a background. In fact, Stacy Keach was in that film, so that kind of dates it. But uh, yeah, a lot of movie companies have used the fort. Sometimes you can recognize it, and other times you can't. It just depends on how tight the shot is.
Was that the James Fenimore or book that you're referring to, James Fenimore Cooper? Was that the one that he wrote when he was staying in, I don't Lewiston or Niagara Falls, wherever it was? Um, One of his first, well, it wasn't his first book, but I think it was his first successful book. Do you recall if it was about a spy? Maybe it was
Oh
being
yeah,
a
the
spy.
spy. He was living in Westchester County at that point.
Oh,
He had some copyright issues that made it important for him to be close to New York City. So yeah, that's a story that has grown up over the years, but probably isn't true.
that so he did. He probably didn't live in Niagara Falls or around there.
Yeah, he was here in 1809, but that's before he wrote most of these popular works.
I see. I see. Interesting. Okay, well, Bob, thank you very much for being a part of today's show. Very, very informative, very interesting. I should have brought my flags with me so I could have shown them. But yeah, you definitely, if you've got young kids, it's definitely a good place to go to. If you're an adult, if you're bringing friends from out of town, it's an interesting place to go to. So I would definitely encourage people to check out Old Fort Niagara. Go there. It's a great place to go, especially on a warm summer day. But if you want more information, by the way, on Old Fort Niagara, then I would suggest that you just go to their website, which I don't have here very easy. Bob, you want to give that to me quickly? It's
Sure, it's oldfortniagara.org.
really easy to remember.
Very easy.
And if you want to ask questions to our live guests, you can do that if you are part of the live show. To be part of the live show, you need to go to our website, stateof.greaterwestnewyork.com, and just register for free. Every Thursday morning, you'll get the invitation for the link to the show, and then you could go on the link and during the show watch it and ask whatever sort of questions you have. Otherwise, you can watch the show. It's archived on our site. It's also rebroadcast every Sunday at 1:30 on our Facebook page and YouTube channels. With that, Bob, thanks a lot. audience, thanks a lot. We'll see everybody next week here on this same bat channel.